She was a daughter-in-law, she was a widow, she was a shadow, for thousands of years. Historians have tried to remain silent about Herbie, 'cause her actions challenge the very idea of female submission. In ancient records, her name is barely mentioned. Even in the genealogy of King David, she is reduced to a single line. But when archaeologists discovered a hidden ceramic tablet with an unusual inscription near the ruins of Judah, they realized the story we thought we knew was incomplete. This woman was not just a victim. She was rightful, intelligent, and determined, and she did what no other dared to do. Neither the law, nor family, nor husband protected her, so she took justice into her own hands, and this is who she was. Tamar had never truly belonged. From the moment she entered Judah's house as the wife of his eldest son, she was a stranger, not just in name or blood, but in the way eyes followed her in silence, in the way whispers fell just short of her ears. She was foreign, a woman given in marriage, not for love, not even for alliance, but out of obligation, arrangement, necessity. In the eyes of the family, she was there to serve a purpose, and once that purpose had been fulfilled or denied, she would be cast aside like a garment no longer needed. The household was quiet in those days, but not in peace. It was the kind of silence that presses on the chest, filled with tension, unspoken resentment, and the lingering scent of something wrong. Her husband, was a man of sharp looks and a sharp tongue. He walked with the pride of being firstborn, but his spirit was cruel, heavy, and unkind. There was no softness in his words, no gentleness in his gaze. Tamar learned quickly to anticipate his moods, to retreat into herself when the shadows in his face darkened. Her days blurred together, in obedience and endurance, in the silent rituals of survival. She cooked, she cleaned, she waited, but the one thing she was meant to do bare, a child, remained undone. Whispers reached her through the walls, through glances at the well, that she must be cursed, that her womb must be barren, that the gods, or God himself, had closed it. But Tamar said nothing. She had seen the way Er looked at her with contempt, as if she were not a woman, but a mirror, reflecting all his failures. She knew the truth that no one else wanted to hear. He was wicked, and the land itself had rejected him. When he died suddenly, there was no mourning, not really, just the cold logistics of loss, the shifting of responsibilities, the rearranging of alliances. Custom dictated that she be given to the next son, Onan. She was still young, still childless, still bound by the law of levirate marriage that decreed her husband's brother must give her a child to carry on the family name. It was not love, nor comfort, nor healing. She received only another contract. Onan smiled more than his brother, but it was the smile of a man who knew he held power and intended to use it. He came to her in the night, and she endured him, knowing that each visit might bring a child, an end to her limbo. But each time he withdrew, spilling his seed onto the ground, denying her not only motherhood but dignity. He did not want to give her what was due. He wanted the appearance of obedience without the cost. It was a betrayal, slow and deliberate, a quiet cruelty masked by ritual. Tamar's body became a vessel of denial, a space filled with absence, and the heavens saw it. The same fate that claimed Uck came for Onan. Tamar watched as another man fell for failing to give her what was rightfully hers. Again, she was left alone, twice widowed, still childless, still voiceless. And now the air around her grew colder. The eyes became harder, the whispers louder. Some said she was a curse. Others avoided her path entirely. She lived within walls that no longer acknowledged her presence. She wore widow's clothes like a second skin, and time dragged its feet. Judah, the patriarch, the man whose word carried the weight of law in the household, looked at her differently now. Fear crept into his gaze, not fear of her, but fear of what seemed to follow her. He told her to return to her father's house, to wait, to live as a widow until his youngest son, Shelah, was old enough to marry. He said it as if it were kindness, but Tamar heard what he would not say. He did not mean for her to return. He did not mean for Shelah to ever be hers. He meant for her to disappear. So she went back, not with rage, not with tears, but with the same quiet obedience they had trained into her since the beginning. She returned to her father's house, a woman both married and unmarried, alive and invisible. Her days became empty containers of grief. Her nights were haunted by what might have been, by the child she never held, by the home that was never hers. Each day she rose to nothing. She cooked, she sat, she stared out windows. The world continued without her. Seasons passed. Shelah grew older. Tamar heard things, rumors carried by merchants, women returning from the market. He had become a man, old enough to wed, but no messenger came, no summons, no offering, no wedding. Judah had broken his word. Tamar watched the sky change. The same sun rose and set above her, but each day it felt further away. Her womanhood, once defined by potential, became a burden. She was a name without a story, a life suspended in waiting. But somewhere deep within, beyond the layers of shame, of sorrow, of silence, something began to stir. A thought, a tremor, a question. What if she refused to be erased? No one knew what Tamar felt in those days, because no one cared to ask. But the weight of injustice does not vanish, it compacts, layer upon layer, until it becomes a stone inside the chest. Tamar carried that stone, and though she still moved through the world as a shadow, something inside her had begun to take shape, something unspoken, something inevitable. Years slipped by with the same numb repetition, and Tamar's life remained suspended in a holding pattern crafted by other men's decisions. She was still wrapped in the garments of widowhood, her body still unclaimed by a future, her soul aching with the weight of promises made and never kept. Though Judah had sworn to give her his youngest son Shelah, once he came of age, the silence between them grew louder with each season. Tamar heard of Shelah's growth, not through official word, not through letters or announcements, but through fragments of marketplace conversation, through women who mentioned how tall he'd grown, how his voice had deepened, how he now joined his father in council and stood among the men at gatherings. Yet Tamar remained untouched by the family's plans, untouched by the law that was meant to protect her. She began to see Judah's promise for what it truly was, a deflection, not a commitment, a way to remove her from the house without admitting guilt, without confronting the reality that 2 of his sons had died under the law of levirate marriage. He feared her now because she had done anything wrong, but because her presence reminded him of what had been lost and what might befall the last of his sons should he fulfill his word. And so Tamar waited in her father's house, not as a daughter newly returned, but as a woman in exile. She was suspended between past and future, neither bride nor widow, a symbol of unfinished business that no one dared address. Her father's house, once a place of childhood comfort, had become a silent cell. There was no room for her future there. She was treated with the awkward politeness reserved for women who had failed at marriage, for women who had brought death with them and returned with empty hands. She moved through the hallways like a ghost, her steps soft, her presence barely acknowledged. Even when she spoke, the words seemed to fall before they reached anyone's ears. Tamar had become a reminder of things unspokenless, shame, uncertainty, and families had always found ways to bury such reminders. She watched as girls, younger than her, were given in marriage, their eyes full of nervous excitement and untested hope. She watched women carry their newborns past her, laughing gently, brushing curls from small foreheads. She saw the lives that were continuing all around her, lives tethered to love, to lineage, to legacy. And in the quiet of her room, beneath the weight of another day without change, Tamar began to feel something she had rarely allowed herself to name: betrayal. Judah had made her a promise, not a favor, not a gift, but a lawful obligation. His words were not kind offerings, but a sacred duty, and still he had turned his back. He had sent her away with the intent to forget, to erase, to cast her beyond the reach of justice. Her fertility had been treated like a transaction. Her body passed from son to son, with no thought of her humanity. She was expected to obey, to remain still, to trust the decisions of men who never asked what she needed. And when they failed her, when they died or broke their word, she was left to shoulder the burden of silence. She was not angry in the way fire burns through brush sudden and bright. Her anger was a slow boil, a persistent ache, a gnawing at the edges of her being. It came not from vengeance, but from clarity. The world was not just, at least not for women like her, foreigners, widows, pawns in the hands of families who wielded power without accountability. She had followed every rule. She had submitted to every expectation, and still she was left alone. The betrayal was not simply that she had been denied a husband or child. It was that she had been denied recognition, legitimacy, value. Judah had looked her in the face, offered her hope, and then banished her into stillness, thinking time would erase her need for justice. He had made her a ghost, a relic, a cautionary tale whispered to younger daughters. Do not be like her. Cursed and forgotten. Tamar knew then that Judah's fear of her was not fear of wrongdoing. It was fear of a woman who might speak, who might act, who might demand what was hers. And still she waited. She waited because she knew that action, once taken, could not be undone. She waited because clarity takes time to crystallize. She waited because the moment would come and she would need to be ready. The silence. Waiting, the exilate, was not the end of her story. It was the preparation. Judah thought her forgotten, but Tamar had learned to listen in silence, to see in darkness, to measure the truth behind every delay. One morning, word reached her that Judah's wife had died. The matriarch was gone, and the mourning had begun. Tamar felt no joy in the news, no vindication, only a cold awareness that something had shifted. A man without a wife was vulnerable in ways he would not admit. A man who had already failed 2 sons might think twice before risking the third. But more than that, Tamar saw that the time of mourning would pass, and when it did, Judah would leave his home again. He would travel. He would conduct business. He would walk roads where expectations blurred and men behaved as though accountability were optional. That knowledge settled into her like a seed, quiet and certain. Her betrayal was complete. The path forward would not be easy, nor clean, nor welcomed. But Tamar no longer needed the approval of those who had failed her. She had been wronged. She had been cast aside. And still she remained. The woman they had tried to forget had not disappeared. She had learned to wait, to watch, to plan. And she would no longer wait for justice to be handed to her. She would reach out and take it. The days following the death of Judah's wife unfolded like a long, muted wind across the hills, subtle in sound, but heavy with movement. Tamar watched the rhythms of mourning from afar. She did not enter that household again, but she heard the patterns, the visitors who came and left, the silence that followed, the ceremonial gestures made for the sake of appearances. She knew grief when it was real, and she knew when it was tradition. What she saw in Judah was not the kind of grief that carves itself into the bones. It was the grief of a man whose world had changed but not broken, a man who still held power, even in loss. And she, still forgotten, still cast away, stood on the outside of that transformation, invisible and waiting. In those long weeks, Tamar's thoughts were not loud. They crept slowly through her, like cool water, finding its way through cracked stone. She did not speak them aloud, for there was no one to listen. And perhaps even if there were, the words would have withered before taking shape. But she felt them build, layer upon layer, beneath the surface of her composure. Her father's house remained unchanged, still a place of domestic predictability, of roles assigned and expectations managed. Tamar played hers well, quiet, obedient, unassuming, yet within her something had begun to shift. There was no single moment that ignited it. It was not a cry or a revelation or a sign in the sky. It was a gradual unfolding, like the slow bloom of a flower under the weight of drought. She awoke each day to the same sky, the same walls, the same silence, but something about the sameness became unbearable. Her hands, once idle in submission, began to twitch with intent. Her feet, once content to stay within the bounds of tradition, began to ache for movement. The quiet became oppressive. The waiting transformed into resistance. She had done what was asked. She had grieved. She had obeyed. And still she had been betrayed. That betrayal did not break her. It built her. She moved carefully through the routines of her exile, watching, listening, gathering pieces of a world that once rejected her. She listened to conversations in the marketplace, to rumors of movement, to the subtle clues left behind in daily exchanges. She learned that Judah would soon travel to Timnah for sheep shearing, a time of commerce, of distraction, of social looseness. It was an occasion men often used as a reprieve from their roles, a place where their actions blurred between business and indulgence. And Tamar, once the pawn in other people's games, began to see the edges of a plan form in the shadows of that knowledge. The idea did not come to her as a lightning strike. It formed slowly, with hesitation, with fear, with the weight of consequence. But it also came with clarity. If she did not act, she would be forgotten forever. The law had failed her. The men around her had failed her. The promise made in the name of righteousness had turned out to be a lie. What then was left for her to trust? Only herself, her hands, her mind, her will. She sat for long hours in the dim light of her chamber, fingers folded tightly, breath slow and deliberate. Not in prayer, not in surrender, but in thought. She traced over the memory of Judah's voice, the memory of her wedding, the memory of betrayal, like a scar that no longer hurt but still throbbed when pressed. She thought of the garments she had once worn as a bride, of the symbols of union that had become costumes of survival. Her widow's clothes clung to her like a sentence binding her to grief that no longer belonged to her. They had become a uniform of exclusion, of social death. She would shed them, not out of rebellion, but out of reclamation. She did not rehearse the plan aloud. She did not write it down or speak it into existence, but it unfolded within her with the precision of necessity. She would go to the road that led to Timnah. She would dress in a way that made her unrecognizable. She would intercept Judah not as his daughter-in-law, but as a woman outside the boundaries of his responsibility, a woman he would look at without recognizing the obligation he once denied. And she would not beg, she would bargain. It was a dangerous plan, one that could unravel her entirely. But the alternative was a life lived in the margins, waiting for justice that would never come. Tamar had no illusions about the consequences. She knew what it would mean to be seen in such a way, to be touched in such a way, to claim what had been withheld with methods that skirted the line between righteousness and scandal. But she also knew what it meant to be forgotten, to be used, to be erased. Her body had once been a thing passed around, weighed, judged, and left barren. Now it would become the tool of her justice, not through seduction, but through control. She would not use softness to lure a man. She would use presence, timing, intelligence. She would take what the law owed her by making the law irrelevant. The night before she set out, she stood alone beneath the stars, arms folded, her face calm but unsleeping. She did not ask for signs. She did not wait for omens. The world had already spoken clearly through its silence. She was not a woman born to be saved. She was a woman forged by absence, by silence, by denial. The next morning, she wrapped herself in different cloth veils that concealed fabrics that suggested something else entirely. She looked into the mirror, not to admire or doubt, but to confirm that the person staring back at her was ready, not to trick, not to steal, but to confront. Her steps were silent as she left the house, but her presence was anything but. Tamar had become the echo of every broken promise, the answer to every unjust silence, and she was no longer waiting. The sun was already low in the sky when Tamar stepped onto the road that led from Iname to Timnah, her feet pressing firmly into the dry, sun-baked earth. The veil covered her face, leaving only her eyes visible, steady, unflinching, watching every figure that passed. She had chosen her clothing with care, neither gaudy nor ragged, but rich in its ambiguity. The fabric flowed around her body like a second skin, neither the mourning clothes of a widow nor the silks of a noblewoman. She wore anonymity as armor. In this moment, she was not Tamar, the widow, not Tamar, the forgotten daughter-in-law. A woman unknown, untethered, and poised, she stood on the threshold of her plan with the stillness of someone who had already suffered through the worst and survived it. This was not desperation, it was execution. The route she chose was no accident. She knew Judah would pass by here. Word had traveled that the shearing season had begun, and like many men of his standing, Judah would visit his shepherds and oversee the work with the air of ritual and importance. These journeys were not just business, they were opportunities for distraction, for indulgence, for escape. Tamar knew that well. She understood the fragile duality of men who held power in public and shed it in private. They were never more vulnerable than when they believed no one was watching. And so she waited at the edge of the road, just beyond the shade of a crumbling wall, as carts rolled past, as travelers kicked up dust behind them. As the day melted into evening and the golden light turned thick and heavy with expectation, she stood with poise, never fidgeting, never shifting. Her body knew what it meant to endure stillness. She had learned patience from years of invisibility, and now she used that patience like a weapon, letting time pass without panic. She did not rush. She did not look over her shoulder. She simply waited, knowing that he would come. The moment she saw him, everything around her stilled. Judah was older now, his walk slower, his face marked by the grief of loss and the weariness of survival. But the pride was still there, settled into his shoulders, etched into the set of his jaw. He traveled with a companion, a servant or friend, whose gaze flitted from face to face, always calculating, always assessing. Tamar remained still until the distance between them was just enough. She stepped forward, not boldly, but deliberately entering their line of sight as if by chance, as if she were merely another figure in the margins of the road. What happened next unfolded with the precision of something rehearsed in silence. Judah's eyes landed on her, and she could feel his gaze weighing her, measuring her. He did not recognize her. Of course he didn't. The woman he had last seen wore widow's clothes and sorrow like a shroud. This woman stood in the light of the setting sun with presence. She was unclaimed, and that was all he needed to know. He approached as she had known he would, and in the exchange that followed, Tamar said only what was necessary. She spoke with control. She accepted no silver, no coins, no momentary price. She asked for something far greater, something symbolic, something irreversible. His seal, his cord, his staff. They were not just objects. They were identity, authority, legacy. And Judah gave them willingly, unknowingly, because men like him rarely imagined that the women they dismissed might one day demand what was sacred. He gave her the instruments of his name, the very items he would use to sign contracts, to represent his tribe, to command his house, and he did so with the ease of a man who believed he was in control. Tamar took them with care, not as trophies, but as proof, not as spoils, but as weapons. They would speak when her voice was denied. They would declare what no one would believe from her lips. And as Judah moved into her, as the transaction fulfilled itself beneath the veil of anonymity, Tamar did not tremble, she did not flinch, she did not feel shame, she felt purpose. This was not revenge, this was reclamation. Her body, once treated as a vessel for obligation, had become the site of her own justice. She had not seduced, she had not manipulated. She had presented herself in a way that allowed him to reveal who he truly was, and he had done so without hesitation. He had shown the world that when freed from consequence, he would take what he desired, discard what he didn't, and forget it all by morning. But Tamar would not forget. The moment burned itself into her mind, not as trauma, but as evidence. She left the road before dawn, the tokens wrapped tightly in cloth, pressed against her chest. Her walk back was slow, steady, unceremonious. She did not smile. She did not cry. She returned to the same house where she had once waited in silence, and stepped back into that silence willingly, knowing it would not be for long. The plan had not ended with the exchange. The plan had only just begun. Soon her body would carry the proof of that night. And when it did, when her belly began to swell with the truth, the world that once turned away from her would be forced to look again. Judah's household would be shaken. The family that discarded her would be confronted with a reality they could neither control nor contain. And Tamar would no longer be a shadow in their history. She would be the axis around which it turned. The days that followed were neither fast nor slow. They passed with the quiet, relentless rhythm of change that cannot be seen until it is already underway. Tamar kept to herself. She moved through her routines with the same precision and silence. She had known for years, and no one suspected anything had shifted. The veil of ordinary life remained intact. Yet within her, something had begun to grow, imperceptible at first, then unmistakable. Her body, once the site of judgment and disappointment, now held a secret that would turn the weight of betrayal back on those who had cast it. She did not announce it. She let the days do the talking. In time, it became impossible to ignore. Her figure changed. Her face softened in places, sharpened in others. Whispers began again, the same kind that had haunted her after Ah's death and Onan's deceit. But this time they were sharper, more curious. There was no husband, no wedding, no announcement. The woman who had been sent away in silence had returned not only with presence, but with life inside her. It did not take long for the news to reach Judah, and when it did, the old fear returned, that primal reflex of shame dressed up as righteousness. He did not ask questions. He did not seek the truth. He declared judgment. Word spread through the village with chilling speed. Tamar, the twice-widowed woman of his household, was pregnant. She had defied the code of mourning. She had, in the eyes of those who did not care to understand, shamed the house of Judah. And so he responded in the only way men of his standing knew how, by condemning what they feared, by punishing what they had caused but could not control. He pronounced her fate with the finality of a stone door slamming shut. She was to be brought out and burned. There was no trial, no inquiry, no pause, just the old script repeating itself. Blame the woman, erase the scandal, preserve the name. The people gathered. Faces, familiar and unfamiliar, filled the space around her, eyes flickering with a mix of curiosity, cruelty, and fear. Tamar stood in the center, not with panic, but with presence. Her hands were calm. Her breath was steady. She had expected this. She had counted on it. When the moment came, she did not scream. She did not beg. Instead, she produced what no one expected: a small bundle of cloth, carefully unwrapped, revealing a seal, a cord, and a staff. Objects so ordinary on their own, but together they became a mirror, one that forced Judah to confront the truth. These were his, not metaphorically, literally, his seal, his cord, his staff, the very symbols of his identity, of his leadership, of his legitimacy. And with them, the accusation did not need to be spoken. It hovered in the air, weighty and undeniable. Judah's face drained of color. For a moment, time seemed to stall. The crowd shifted in discomfort, murmurs rising like smoke around them. He recognized the objects instantly. More than that, he recognized the truth they carried. Tamar had not seduced a stranger. She had not broken a vow. She had simply taken what was rightfully hers from the man who refused to give it. He could have denied it. He could have twisted the narrative, clung to pride, claimed theft or deceit. But the evidence was too perfect, too damning. And Tamar stood there, not with triumph, but with dignity. She was not gloating. She had not orchestrated this moment for revenge. She had done what needed to be done so that the world would see, so that truth would no longer be buried beneath the weight of lies. Judah's voice, when it finally came, was not loud. It was quiet, hoarse, almost broken. The words, simple and unforgettable, turned the tide. He admitted her righteousness. He acknowledged her justice. And in that moment, something ancient shifted. The power dynamic that had held Tamar captive for so long cracked open. The woman who had been accused, who had been sentenced, who had been forgotten, was now the one who stood justified before the community. But vindication did not come with applause. It came with silence, the kind that follows revelation, the kind that fills the space when the truth is finally too heavy to ignore. No one approached her. No one embraced her. They simply stepped back, made space, and let her remain. Tamar returned to her home, not as a disgraced woman, but as a figure reborn. Her body, now visibly carrying the life conceived that day on the road to Timnah, had become a symbol of justice, secured by intellect, by courage, by strategy. She did not rely on force, or on the sympathy of others, or on the changing moods of powerful men. She had crafted her justice from the very tools of her oppression, and she had done it alone. Her story would not be told in full for generations. Her name would be written in passing, tucked quietly into a genealogy where few would notice it. But for those who looked closer, it would speak louder than any proclamation. It would say that there was a woman who was wronged, who was silenced, who was cast aside, and who rose through the ashes of public condemnation with her head held high, holding the truth in one hand and legacy in the other. Time did not rush to vindicate Tamar after the firestorm of public disgrace turned revelation. The world around her did not transform overnight. No songs were sung in her name. No monuments were raised. The days returned to their quiet rhythm, the sky as wide and indifferent as it had always been, and yet everything had changed. Tamar carried within her not just the lives of 2 sons, but the unshakable weight of a truth she had forced the world to acknowledge. She had walked through shame, accusation, and erasure not with the loud rebellion of revolution, but with the silent precision of justice. Her belly grew as the seasons turned, and with it, the shape of history itself began to shift, ever so subtly. She lived quietly during the months of her pregnancy, but not hidden. There was no more hiding. People saw her now, though many could not meet her eyes for long. Some turned away in discomfort, others nodded with an awkward kind of reverence. The same voices that once whispered curses and suspicion now spoke her name in low, uneasy tones, not because they understood her, but because they no longer knew how to place her. Tamar no longer fit into their categories. She had not followed the script assigned to her. She had rewritten it, line by line, action by action, until it became something no one could control. When the time came, she gave birth to 2 sons. The moment was not ceremonial, not marked by a crowd or a prophet or a herald. It was personal, painful, intimate, a testament not only to the power of her body, but to the determination of her will. The first boy's hand emerged before his body, and the midwife tied a red thread around it. But then the second child pushed past and was born first, and the firstborn came second. It was an odd, symbolic detail, but one Tamar never forgot. Life had reordered itself in the womb, just as she had reordered the terms of her story. What was meant to be reversed itself. What was forgotten gave way to legacy. What was denied was now undeniable. She named them Perez and Zerah to many. They were simply two more children born into a growing lineage, but to Tamar they were the embodiment of her victory. Not a vengeful triumph, not a cry of conquest, but a quiet, living proof that she had taken hold of what was hers not by force, but by faith in her own justice, in her own agency. Her sons were not trophies, they were continuations. She raised them with strength and tenderness, teaching them not just to walk and speak and grow, but to understand where they came from, not in shame, but in truth. Years passed, and Judah aged. His power waned, his voice softened. He remained a patriarch in name, but even he could not forget the moment Tamar stood before him, holding his seal, his staff, his cord. He never spoke against her again. Her presence was no longer a threat, was a memory, a reminder, a mirror. And though history would not give her long passages, though the scriptures would mention her name only once in the lineage of kings, that single mention would echo louder than chapters, because when the generations were traced, when the line that led to David and eventually to Jesus was recorded, her name stood among the very few women included. It was not a mistake, it was not mercy, it was recognition. Tamar had begun her journey as an outsider, married into a family that never fully welcomed her, used as a vessel, then cast aside. But she ended her journey as a cornerstone in a legacy, far greater than anyone around her could have foreseen. The woman who had no voice became a name in the foundation of kingdoms. The woman condemned to burn became the ancestor of kings and messiahs, not because the world chose her, but because she chose herself. The storytellers did not linger on her tale. They preferred quieter women, more compliant narratives, simpler lessons. Tamar was complicated. She disrupted the moral order. She acted without permission. She used her mind, her body, her silence, her timing, and, for that, she could never be fully embraced by those who valued obedience above justice. And so, for centuries, she remained a footnote, a line, a mystery. But for those who looked deeper, her story never stopped speaking. It spoke to those who had been cast aside, to those told to wait in silence, to those who suffered beneath the weight of broken promises. Tamar's story became a quiet anthem, not of rebellion, but of survival, of strategy, of self-claimed justice in a world built to deny it. She did not wait for deliverance. She became her own deliverer. In the end, the history books would not tell children of her fire. They would not recount her nights of waiting, her walk to the crossroads, the risk she bore for truth. But her blood would flow through the line of kings. Her legacy would endure, tucked between names, carried on the backs of those who would never know her face, but would owe their very existence to her courage. And that, perhaps, was the final form of justice Tamar had always known she was capable of achieving. Not fame, not admiration, but impact. The kind that cannot be erased. The kind that lives in names passed down, in children born, in the storylines of destinies forever altered. She had once stood on the margins of her own life, but in the end she wrote herself into the heart of history.